thank you all for attending. We've just started recording now, but thank you all for joining us this Friday morning and what is the last week before Christmas, it seems. It's really great to have you all here and be able to talk with Jesse and Saul today. My name's Kate Minsher. I'm the Managing Director of Rewiring Australia, and I'm just going to make some opening remarks before I pass on to the two men you're all here to hear from. But I want to begin also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. I'm on the outskirts of Narn today on the Wiradjuri Nation of the Kulin people. I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Now, today we're here to talk to Jesse Jenkins and Saul Griffith about their experience of the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the IRA or the IRA. It is a piece of legislation introduced last year in the States that really saw the largest investment we've ever seen on the clean energy transformation. And a big part of that was electrification and how the federal government is going to play a role in fueling households, businesses and industries to electrify to clean energy. I can't say much more about the IRA in front of Saul and Jesse because they are here to be the experts, but it's a year and a bit on, and we're really keen to hear how it's going and what it means for Australia. Just a bit of housekeeping. We've got 45 minutes today. We're going to try and wrap up on time, but I've also got two heavyweights here and a lot of participants with us today. So Jesse and Saul are going to speak, give their presentation shortly. I'll ask them a couple of questions. If we have time, we'll throw to some questions from the audience. So if you've got a burning question you want to ask, pop it in the chat. We've also got Jess and Kristen from our team at Rewiring Australia who'll be keeping an eye on that chat during the discussion. So thank you, Kristen, for that little wave. So before I pass to our guests, just a bit of a refresher on who we are at Rewiring Australia. We're a research and advocacy organisation launched back in 2021 by Dan Cass and Saul Griffith. And we exist to electrify everything and accelerate that electrification. Saul's going to run through some numbers with you, but there is no pathway to net zero without the electrification of our households, businesses and industry. It also helps that electrification is going to save energy users money, which is a core part of the work that we do. Our work is driven by data-based research, making the case of why electrification makes economic and climate sense. We pair this with very targeted policy interventions, and we advocate fiercely with governments at all levels of implementing those. We also spend a lot of time talking about electrification. No doubt this year you've seen Dan and Saul in the news quite a bit, talking about the investment that we need from our federal government and why households should make the decision to electrify. But our whole team at Rewiring Australia, we're a small but busy team, and we've spent the year in conference halls, community halls, boardrooms and on Zooms talking about electrification too. And part of that's about building our electrification army, which sounds terrifying, and I think I need to find a new anecdote, but it is so critical to our work and has seen us win big in 2023. So if you'll indulge me for a few more minutes, I just want to give you a recap of the 2023 year that was the year of electrification. So this year we spent a lot of time in Canberra, and we collaborated with the climate movement, industry, unions and civil society to put the ask on the government to invest in electrification. And we were pretty effective. This year, we had the first electrification budget. The federal government committed $1 billion in finance for Clean Energy Finance Corporation to support households electrify and upgrade their homes. This was a huge down payment, shows the investment this government is willing to make in supporting the electrification revolution. And that wasn't it. Also in the federal budget, we saw $300 million worth of funding allocated to upgrading social housing, working in partnership with states. And we've seen a number of state governments commit to matching that money and start the process of retrofitting their social housing to remove gas, improve efficiency and electrify. We also see at the federal level $300 million for businesses in tax incentives to electrify and $100 million to support councils electrify their assets. It was truly a huge win at the federal level with this government showing their willingness to invest. And in 2024, we're going to continue this advocacy work, pushing for the rollout of the $1 billion worth of finance, but also playing a key role in shaping what that looks like. You may have seen last You may have seen last week an article in The Guardian talking about the work that we'll be doing in 2024, partnering with the Australian National University, exploring how things like income contingent loans will make finance for electrification more accessible for more households. At a federal level, we're also seeing some bipartisan support for electrification, which is going to be critical if we're going to win, and we're going to encourage all households and businesses to electrify. The Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg will be chairing and has announced a Senate electrification inquiry. Rewiring Australia made a submission to this inquiry along with hundreds of organisations and individuals. I've spoken to the organisers of the inquiry and they were quite blown away of how much interest there has been in this particular Senate inquiry, of people telling their stories of how they electrified, why, and some of the barriers they've hit. And in the next 12 months, they're going to be doing a tour around the country and hearing these stories direct through hearings. And we look forward to participating. At a state level, there's also been some big wins. Obviously, that matched funding with the federal government on electrifying social housing has been critical, and governments have continued to show investment incentive schemes that support electrification through their various state-based programs. But the standout winner has to be the Victorian government and Minister D'Ambrosio with their announcement of banning new gas connections next year. A truly bold policy decision that Rewiring Australia welcomes wholeheartedly and looks forward to supporting the Victorian government in the rollout of that policy in the new year. But all of these wins have come off the back of building an incredible supporter base across the country, of which you've all been a part of. So I want to say a sincere thank you to you all, and also talk a bit about some fantastic work we'll be doing in the new year and have started this year of galvanising the support we've seen and putting it to action in local communities. So we've done some great work this year of I'll jump back and to say Saul was blown away when he did his book tour of the localised support and passion that people want to bring to electrifying their own communities. And based on that, we've also been inundated with people wanting to start local campaigns of how they can encourage their friends and neighbours to electrify, talk to their local councils about what they can do to electrify their assets and to support community infrastructure. So based on that, we've been working with a number of groups this year and hope to expand into the new year of what does designing and implementing localised campaigns and action plans in communities look like to help accelerate and drive electrification. There's been some fantastic research released this year by Green Buildings Australia that found we need to electrify about 500 homes every day in order to meet our targets of emissions reductions. And we can't do that without having armies in every community that are talking about how you electrify and supporting their friends and neighbours do that. So thank you for your support in that. And next year, we're going to be looking at hosting more webinars like today, which puts some pressure on us all to make sure that it's a success. But I think that we'd really love to share some more of our knowledge and hear from you all as well in the new year. So that's me. I'm going to pass on now to our main guests, the main stars. I'm going to introduce them both, but then throw to Saul. Saul Griffith probably needs no introduction to you all here. He's a writer, an author, an inventor, and a scientist and an engineer. He co-founded Rewiring Australia, but also co-founded Rewiring America, where he played a really instrumental role in the Inflation Reduction Act and its design. And he speaks to us today about that shared knowledge between Australia and America in this front. And we've got Jesse Jenkins, who may not be familiar with you, as Saul. Jesse is an assistant professor at Princeton University, focusing on macro-scale energy systems. He is here in Australia on holidays with his family and has very generously given Rewiring Australia 2 days to spend with him. Yesterday, we had some fantastic meetings with federal departments and agencies, sharing the learnings from the Inflation Reduction Act and American energy system, and answering lots of questions around what that means here. He was received very well, and people have been incredibly grateful for the wealth of knowledge he offers. And just a big thank you to Jesse for spending some time with us while he's here on holidays. So I'm going to pass now over to Saul. Thank you. Saul, you're on mute.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Jesse, for being here. I certainly hope that Princeton gives you full tenure and full professorship on the back of your work on the IRA. It would be well deserved. I'm going to start by doubling down on Kate's army proposal, I think we actually need to build two armies in Australia. There's the advocacy army that we're building here today, which is extraordinary. And I think everyone both participating in and listening to this call is part of building that army. We still have we still have to make our climate response and all of government response. So that means large federal policy, such as the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, such as the electrification in the Australian budget this year. We need to get more policy wins like that, but we need to translate that work down into state governments and ultimately on the ground into communities through local council and through community action. So advocacy army all the way through Australian politics is important. We need to be getting the Australian government to invest at least $50 billion this year if they wish to be as ambitious as the US government. And I'm actually hoping we can be more ambitious. And I very carefully use the word invest, not spend, because I think people are now confused the idea that we need to spend versus this is an investment that will pay dividends. But the other army that I'm really hoping we also build is the tradie army, which will really be the front line of defense against climate change. I'm glad Jesse is nodding. I was going to thought I'd have to translate and tell him that a tradie is Australian for contractor. So these are the skilled tradespeople who will on the ground be electrifying our homes, installing vehicle charging infrastructure, building out our solar and our wind farms. This is really, there's a small army of advocates like us, and it needs an enormous army of skilled technicians to implement this energy transition. Anyway, with that, I'm going to show a couple of slides quickly. Hopefully you can tell me that this is working. First, and last week, if you asked me the odds of being able to say this, I would have said 0. But literally this week at COP28, which is the annual climate summit of the United Nations, quite an extraordinary thing happened. Not quite as extraordinary as we would like, meaning the climate activists would like words that are phase out of fossil fuels by 2040 or something similar. But in spite of that, nearly every country in the world has actually agreed to transition away from fossil fuels. And it's extraordinary that in a fossil fuel nation, that the COP actually produced this language. That is obviously the main driver of climate change. Why I think that is an extraordinary movement is that's going to put a huge wind behind the sails. It means the penny will continue to drop in order to transition away from fossil fuels. Really, our principal strategy is to electrify everything. And I think the statement at COP28 that we are and the whole world is agreeing to transition away from fossil fuels will only throw, hopefully, electric fuels on this fire. However, the reason the activists aren't entirely satisfied is there is still an ambition gap. The ambition gap is a way of describing the difference between what governments have committed to, and remember, it's a non-binding commitment at COP28, so that means we will transition away, but there's no deadline. That means really the world's commitments still look like 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming, which is a big ambition gap from the 1.5 or 2 degrees that we should really be pushing for. And that means we need to figure out every possible way to go faster than the market otherwise would, or as I think about it, market transformation. How do we make sure that the decision to electrify the machines of the world, whether they be on the supply side generating the electricity or the demand side, like the cars in your homes using that electricity, we need to make the decisions to buy those electric machines the easiest decision, the cheapest decision, and have a skilled workforce ready to deliver that product to us. I'm not going to say much about the IRA because Jesse is here and he'll say it a lot better. I'm just going to give you this one slide, which is a summary. This is breaking down I'm not going to test you all on the tiny little details here at the end of the show, but it is to say that electrification really comes through as the principal strategy if you break down every single component. On the supply side, that's a huge number of tax credits for building out renewable energy and zero emission electricity. On the demand side, that's finance for electric vehicles, finance for households, discrete subsidies for all of the machines in households and small businesses. and even some incentives to manufacture all of those electrical machines. This is what we're pushing for in Australia for 2024 as the sort of big goal, policy ambition for Rewiring Australia. Just to emphasize the importance of market transformation and doing what you can now in terms of emissions reductions. What the climate says is the earlier you get emissions reductions, the more they count, because it's a cumulative carbon dioxide problem. This is a new way of looking at Australia's climate emissions. There's a lot of received wisdom in politics that has us looking at our climate problem as a supply side problem. So how do we decarbonize industry and how do we decarbonize the existing grid? This is a different way of looking at it. This looks at the emissions in Australia below the dotted line. That's the emissions we export as fossil fuels. That's what we have to transition away from. This traditionally drives a fear in the government. How do we replace the income from those fossil fuels with something else? Australia needn't worry. We shipped 55% of the world's lithium last year. We have a huge amount of nickel, copper, all of the required metals. That will be where Australia wins over the next 50 years in producing the metals required for this energy transition. Above the dotted line is our the emissions that occur within Australia. You can actually see I've broken that down into trade. So actually, about 40% of emissions within Australia's economy are producing our fossil fuels and other things that we export. So when we change that export economy, we will actually zero out the emissions on those trade emissions for the large part. And above that is the domestic emissions, which is about 60% of our emissions. And that is the emissions of our households, our small businesses, etc. And you can see I've got green, orange, and red. That's a very coarse description or summary of green is technology that is ready to go and deploy today. That's rooftop solar, that's electric vehicles, that's heat pumps for your water heating, heat pumps for your space heating, that's batteries, etc. And the reason I emphasize that is traditionally, if we only consider the supply side in a government climate response, we're going to miss the fact that you have to decarbonize the demand side and the supply side at the same rate. And in fact, we're going to get the most emission reductions in the near term in this domestic economy. 42% of our domestic emissions actually happen at decisions you make around the kitchen table. Again, that's what car do you drive, what heats your home, where does your electricity come from? It's actually another 28 or 29% is in small businesses and the commercial sector. So really about 70% if you believe that people also make their decisions about their small businesses around the same kitchen tables. So this is where we have a huge opportunity in the near term emissions reductions in Australia. And, as I like to say, this is how do we electrify the 5 or 6 things in your life, the infrastructure of your life. Electrify your cars, your kitchens, your bathing, your space heating, and do as much of that with rooftop solar, which we know in Australia is the cheapest delivered energy in human history. So after financing, Jesse will probably boggle his mind because this is not true in the US, but after financing, rooftop solar in Australia is 3 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour installed. And that's the win behind our sales. So that's the global contribution Australia has to boast about and show. It's like we've had this incredible regulatory success on rooftop solar. That's going to make the energy transition cheaper. Let's go. Of course, we will also need big wind and big solar and big transition. So hopefully if we prove the economic benefits to households, they'll also become the army fighting for offshore wind farms and large-scale renewables, which are the installations to make sure we have 100% reliable energy systems. I'm going to finish on this one slide, which is a nice segue for Jesse. The biggest climate bill in human history was called the Inflation Reduction Act. You might all sort of wonder a little bit, why would you call a climate bill the Inflation Reduction Act? And this is data from Australia, and this is actually really part of the story that electrification itself is anti-inflationary. This is a 30-year history of the total energy cost of running an Australian household, including its petrol and its diesel, including its natural gas, including its electricity. You can see that it's consistently rose at or slightly above the rate of inflation for the past 30 years. But the extraordinary thing you can say is that if you financed an Australian household today to buy solar, to buy electric vehicles, and to buy electric heat for its household, the ongoing cost of running that household remains fixed because you're just paying finance charges 20 years into the future for those purchases. And so that is quite literally anti-inflationary. The question now is the investment for a household to purchase those things, because you have to spend a lot of money to save that money in the long term, does that return positively? And the answer for Australia is it now does. And this is why we're building a macroeconomic argument for the incumbent government here, that if the government helps Australians invest in their domestic and household infrastructure and electrification, that the country could be saving $300 or $400 billion a year by the end of this decade because of the consequences of this chart. So I'll leave it there. This success story is Australia's contribution to speeding up the world on this very critical energy transition. Thanks a lot.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here in Melbourne and to join Rewiring Australia for yesterday and today, learning more about Australia's energy transition and sharing what I can from the U.S. perspective. Delighted to share that we are making significant progress in the U.S. after many years of delay at the federal level, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law in the last Congress that are truly historic advancements in the U.S. energy policy and energy transition landscape. What these laws effectively amount to is the fact that the full financial might of the U.S. federal government is now firmly aligned behind a clean energy transition. That's really a game changer. There are few forces in the world as powerful as the purse strings of the U.S. federal government, and having the financial incentives provided by these laws as tailwinds behind the clean energy transition is truly a game changer for us in the United States, and I think by extension, hopefully, spilling over to the world as a whole. What the Inflation Reduction Act effectively does is puts clean energy on sale for all Americans. It does that through a set of tax credits, grants, rebates, and loan guarantees that will be worth well over $500 billion over the next decade and more beyond that, really comprehensively across the board, making all of the various solutions we need in our climate toolkit much cheaper for everyone to adopt, and an attempt to basically shift the economic incentives behind millions of different decisions that you or I might make about how to heat our homes or what vehicles to drive. Businesses are making on a consistent basis about what kinds of fleet vehicles to purchase, how to power their industrial processes, where to get their electricity, et cetera. All those decisions have to be shifted in the favor of the clean side of the ledger. You can, of course, do that with carbon pricing, as Australia has experimented with, and we've had our own failed attempts to get off the ground in the United States. Of course, makes fossil energy more expensive and internalizes the damages that those fuels cause, which is an appropriate prescription from economics, but of course, challenging politically. And so the other alternative is to make clean energy cheaper, right? And that's the approach that the Inflation Reduction Act uses. So either way, we have to make the financial incentives line up, or it's going to be difficult to get the pace of transition that we need out of, if people have to make these decisions out of the goodness of their own heart and not in the interest of their own pocketbooks. So what we see in the Inflation Reduction Act is truly a comprehensive effort to support energy efficiency and electrification through tax credits and rebates for individuals and for households and for businesses. Incentives for electric vehicles, again, both a personal vehicle tax credit for folks who buy their own vehicles, but also a commercial vehicle tax credit that's available for businesses and leased vehicles. Long-term support for clean electricity of all forms. We've had on-again, off-again tax credits that expire every few years and really throw the industry into chaos as these extensions are debated in Congress every couple of years. Now we have long-term clarity as to the strength of these incentives over at least the next decade. The law establishes a production tax credit or investment tax credit for all forms of carbon-free electricity that's available until we cut greenhouse gas emissions in the electricity sector to 25% of our 2022 level, so 75% reduction from emissions at the time the law was passed. That's unlikely to happen until around 2035. And so really any electricity projects, clean electricity projects that commence construction through the next 12 or 13 years will be able to claim full advantage of these clean electricity tax credits. There are also new tax credits established by the law for clean hydrogen production and clean fuels like sustainable aviation fuel, expanded incentives for carbon capture and storage, and a new credit for direct air capture technologies that remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere and store them. And via the bipartisan infrastructure law, which passed in 2021, and which included a wide range of infrastructure investments, as well as a set of energy innovation policies, including technology demonstration programs for a range of less mature, more nascent technologies that need to be scaled up over the next decade, place-based hubs for the build-out of hydrogen and direct air capture, and support for network infrastructure like electricity transmission expansion and CO2 pipelines. What all of these policies effectively do in aggregate is put Uncle Sam's thumb firmly on the scale on the favor of clean energy choices. And this is already having a significant effect across the economy. It's worth noting, though, that the Inflation Reduction Act is more than just an effort to shift the economic calculus and the different decisions that we're making, or to accelerate electrification and decarbonization. It really embeds a number of different policy goals at once, which all should be taken stock of. That includes efforts to make clean energy cheap, not just in subsidized terms, but in real dollar terms, by driving innovation and real cost declines in the underlying technologies. As we know, we've seen the costs of wind and solar and lithium-ion batteries plummet over the last decade, thanks to public policy support that helped scale up these technologies when they were nascent, expensive, quote-unquote, alternative energy technologies, to the point where they're now mainstream, affordable options that can scale at hundreds of gigawatts of deployment per year. That's effectively what we need to do to complete the rest of the toolkit of technologies that will be helpful in the 2030s and 2040s as we transition to a fully net zero economy. And so there's a variety of policies in these bills to accelerate demonstration, scale up, and cost declines for these technologies, as well as long-term commercial deployment subsidies for that first decade of scale up. That includes hydrogen, carbon capture, advanced nuclear, direct air capture, low carbon liquids, et cetera. There's a lot of policy incentives in these laws to also reshape supply chains, in particular to decouple from China, overwhelming reliance on Chinese manufacturing and components for solar, wind, batteries, and critical minerals. That includes tax credits to directly manufacture these products in the United States. Actually, the guidance for those rules just came out this morning in America. That includes direct production incentives for US facilities that produce solar and wind components across the full supply chain, critical minerals of all kinds of types, and battery, cell, and pack assembly, as well as a set of demand pull incentives that tie our tax credits for clean electricity deployment, batteries, and electric vehicles to sourcing domestic content. So not only are we subsidizing the supply side, but we're encouraging developers of clean hydrogen projects or clean electricity projects or batteries or EVs, EV manufacturers, to source their products from the United States as well. As well as from friendly countries. So particularly on the battery assembly and critical minerals front, the law contemplates sourcing a supply chain that extends across North America and other countries with free trade agreements with the United States, chief amongst those Australia. There are also grants for battery recycling and critical minerals production in the infrastructure law that support this development as well. Another key objective embedded throughout these laws is improvement of environmental justice outcomes and the reduction of pollution and improvements in air quality and public health. There's about $60 billion of investments across the Inflation Reduction Act targeted towards improvements in environmental justice to reduce harmful pollution in the most environmentally overburdened communities across the country. The law as a whole will dramatically reduce air pollution, saving tens of thousands of American lives that would otherwise be lost to pollution impacts. And there's a set of provisions to try to ensure more equitable access to electrification, efficiency, and clean energy solutions to those in the lower income brackets that typically don't have the purchasing power to buy these technologies on their own. And that includes a particular electrification support through state-managed whole home electrification and efficiency rebate programs designed to get out to lower and middle income households. And a new green bank program that provides about $30 billion in funding to capitalize state-level green banks to provide concessionary financing to advance these goals. Finally, there are a number of provisions trying to drive economic opportunity and investment in what we call energy communities across America. That includes advanced clean energy manufacturing and investments in clean electricity. Energy communities are defined in the law as communities that have been historically reliant on fossil energy extraction, processing, transportation, or use, or where coal mines or coal plants have recently closed. So I know similar issues here in Australia are on the agenda to make sure that communities that have traditionally powered our economy with energy are not left behind in this transition and see clear economic opportunities and investment and employment opportunities in their communities as well. And so the law has bonus tax credits for clean electricity investments within these energy communities, sets aside $4 billion for clean energy manufacturing tax credits that would support over $12 billion in investment in those communities, and establishes a new $250 billion loan authority at the Department of Energy that can help retool and repurpose existing energy infrastructure to ensure that those assets are reused as part of our clean economy. Overall, when I take a look at these policies, what I see is the potential to truly reshape the politics of clean energy in America. We need to sustain this clean energy transition over decades, right? This is going to be a 3-decade-long transition. And we need, if to do that, we're going to need to reshape the politics of clean energy so that it's broadly supported across the economy and across communities. So we understand that this is a national mission that we're all taking part in and that is delivering significant benefits. And so by making clean energy cheaper, by delivering economic opportunity to a diverse set of communities across the country, by shaping the energy transition to ensure that communities are not left behind, and by improving public health in dramatic and tangible ways, I think this can build the long-term support that we need for the clean energy transition. All right, well, how well is this law working? It passed about a year and a half ago now. And so we're starting to see some of the early indicators of where things are going. I should note, however, that most of the money is just starting to flow out the door. There are a lot of new rules and tax credits and grant programs that needed to be established and staffed. And so, while about a year and a half has elapsed, many of those programs are just starting to get funding out the door. Some of the most important tax credit guidances or rules are finally being finalized, as we speak, including, again, the advanced manufacturing tax credit today and the clean hydrogen tax credit, which we're expecting sometime in the next week or so. That said, we are seeing a significant impact on planned investment across the economy, which is starting to be an effective early indicator of where things are going. So I'd highlight the Clean Investment Monitor, which is a new resource launched by Rhodium Group and MIT that is tracking on a quarterly basis, so as close to real time as we can, aggregate investments in our clean economy across the United States. What we can see in this graphic here is the significant acceleration of investments after the passage of the infrastructure law, the IIJA, that's the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, in the middle of 2022. Over the past 12 months or 4 quarters, we've seen $225 billion of aggregate investment in our clean energy economy across the United States. That's $64 billion in the third quarter alone. That's an 8% increase just on the previous quarter. So we're seeing significant accelerations and increases. I wanted to highlight here that the retail segment, which is effectively electrification, this includes heat pumps, energy efficiency, electric vehicle adoption, the kinds of decisions that we make in our households, as Saul was mentioning, accounts for the largest share of this investment. Over half of the total, or about $117 billion over the past year. So just to emphasize what Saul was saying, that electrification of our lifestyles, our homes, our businesses is a central front in the clean energy transition and accounts for a huge amount of the overall investment that is already occurring and that is needed in the long term. In terms of emissions impacts, I have been leading a project called the Repeat Project over the last 2 years, which tries to model and is close to real time the impacts of proposed and enacted federal policies. And we update these analysis on a regular basis to provide a real-time look at the progress and gaps that remain on the path to net zero in the United States. And so what we're seeing in our most recent published analysis is as follows. We've seen emissions in the US actually peak around 2005 to 2007 and fall by about 1 billion metric tons since then, from 6.6 to 5.6 billion tons in 2021. Without any passage of additional legislation in the last Congress, so we froze policies at the beginning of the Biden administration and the last Congress in January 2021, we estimate that emissions were on track to fall by about 2% per year, roughly continuing the trend that we saw over the last decade. Now, with passage of the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we estimate that these laws will double the pace of decarbonization in the United States through 2035 to about 4% per year. That's enough to get us to about 37 to 41% below our peak levels by 2030 and about 50% or so, give or take a couple percentage points, by 2035. Unfortunately, even that pace is still falling behind our national objectives, which are to cut greenhouse gas emissions to half of our peak levels by 2030. So that would require about a 6% per year annual pace of decarbonization. Another way to look at it is that we're basically running about 10 years behind schedule, hitting that 50% reduction sometime around 2035 rather than 2030. And so additional action is needed. I should say, though, that by making clean energy cheaper for all other actors across the economy. It makes it easier for states, for regulatory authorities, and for individual businesses and homes to step up their level of climate ambition as well. And we're already seeing that ripple effect across states that have been increasing the stringency and ambition of their own policies. In New Jersey, where I live, we previously had a goal of reaching 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. After passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the modeling that my group did at Princeton to show how it impacted the economics of the transition for the state, we now find that we can do that by 2035 at an affordable cost that means paying no more than we currently pay for electricity in the state. And after passage of our study, the governor updated his executive order to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035. So accelerating our targets by 15 years thanks to the passage of this federal legislation. It really is a comprehensive strategy. If you look at the estimated budgetary impact, again, this is an estimate. I think we'll actually spend quite a bit more than this as these programs get up and running. But this is the official Congressional Budget Office and Joint Committee on Taxation estimates of the budgetary impact of the law over the first decade. And you can see that it really cuts across all major sectors of the economy. Electricity and electrification, though, are the majority of these investments, particularly over the next decade, reflecting their commercial maturity and their importance in the overall decarbonization pathway. Electricity itself, clean electricity sources are likely to receive the largest share of clean energy of investment, followed by building efficiency and electrification in the transportation sector, most of that going to EVs and charging stations, but really a broad set of additional policies that affect industry and materials production, agriculture, forestry and lands, clean energy manufacturing and materials, and a set of cross-cutting programs supporting hydrogen, carbon capture, the green bank programs, and other financing vehicles. So really quite comprehensive collection of really dozens of individual policies packaged together in the Inflation Reduction Act. That shows up in the emissions impacts of the law. We estimate that really we see emissions impacts across all major emitting sectors of the economy, although I should note that over half of those emissions reductions come from transportation and the power sector, with the acceleration of electrification of vehicles and the growth of renewable energy, two trends that were already well underway but are effectively supercharged by passage of these laws. The building sector contributes another 140 million tons or so, 140 million tons by 2035 through electrification and efficiency. But we do see contributions, sizable contributions from all major emitting sectors of the economy. Now, of course, passage of economic incentives like those in the Inflation Reduction Act is necessary, but by no means sufficient. The challenge we have now is to actually build the physical infrastructure of this net zero economy. That means electrifying households, retrofitting them for efficiency, building thousands of miles of transmission lines, record-setting paces of renewable energy expansion, new networks for hydrogen production and transport and use, et cetera, et cetera. And so the challenge before us now, I think, is one very similar to that in Australia, which is to get to work physically building this economy. And there's lots of work left to be done. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I'm going to jump into some questions now. I think we might have time for a question, one for Jesse, one for Saul. And thank you for feeding through some questions on the chat. Jesse, I've got a question for you that's a bit of a cobbling together of a few questions on the chat. People are really keen to know how Trump-proof the IRA is. I might adjust that question a little to make it more relevant for our audience. How do we build bipartisan support on something like the Inflation Reduction Act to ensure that governments don't come and undo all the hard work that's been done? I think maybe if you could answer the Trump part quickly, because I think that might be a little bit different to governments.
Yeah, I would say there's few things that are Trump-proof. Even our very system of liberal democracy may not be Trump-proof, and so I hesitate to offer any consolations about the risks there. I think they're quite existential risks for our country in the next election. Every election we say is the most important ever, but I think it's actually true this time. Barring the re-election of a aspiring fascist dictator, I think the legislative durability of this law is actually quite strong, and by design. And so that is reflected in some of the elements that I mentioned earlier about reshaping the politics of clean energy. By making clean energy more affordable and cheaper for households and businesses, it makes anyone trying to repeal this law actually increasing energy costs for Americans, and that's very easy to attack those who would want to repeal the law under those grounds. We're also seeing enormous amounts of investment in manufacturing, supply chains, in clean energy, clean electricity technologies, the majority of which are actually sited within Republican represented districts. So a really diverse set of communities across the country are seeing very tangible economic opportunities around the clean economy showing up in their lives. And the longer this law is in effect, the more of that we'll see on the ground, the more people who will know someone employed in a clean energy manufacturing facility will understand that their local taxes are lower because a wind farm is contributing to the property tax base, paying for their schools, their firefighters, et cetera. And those kinds of tangible impacts also really matter. And we're seeing, I should say, a variety of very well organized and effective industrial interests planning, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment under the premise that this law continues. And businesses hate uncertainty. And so now that this is the default, this is the status quo, many industrial interests will also join with climate advocates and others to prevent repeals of these laws. And so it's those kinds of shifts in the political landscape that I think make it quite durable from a legislative perspective, barring, again, any kind of extreme fascist takeover of our executive branch. And so I think if we can get through this next election and the next couple of years of solidifying the progress on the ground, it will really have a significant impact on the long-term durability of this project.
I'm going to ask you a sneaky second question, Jesse. It's also come up a bit in the chat about nuclear. I'm reluctant to give it any airspace, but it has been quite dominant in the discussion around energy transition here, and you mentioned its role in the States. What do you think the role for nuclear looks like in the Australian energy transition?
Yeah, I should say I'm a strong supporter of nuclear power in theory. In practice, we actually need to see the industry deliver on new projects that can be built affordably and on time. In the US, we have a very different context, which is that about 20% or a fifth of all of our electricity and about half of all of our carbon-free electricity today comes from existing nuclear power stations. And it's been very important that we maintain that foundation of clean, firm generation as we try to rapidly phase out coal and natural gas plants. Trying to do both at the same time is simply too hard. Makes us run twice as fast to stay in place. And so in the US, we've really strongly prioritized keeping those existing reactors. In general, for new reactors, we have broad policy support in the US for all carbon-free electricity technologies, but now it's up to industry to actually deliver and build new projects and new reactors. And so far, they're not delivering. And so I think in the Australian context, you have abundant land, excellent renewable energy potential, much more affordable rooftop solar than we do in the States. There's really not a lot of particular need for the deployment of nuclear power, which is much more well suited to places that lack those kinds of resources, right? Places like the northeastern United States that don't have excellent wind or solar resources, places like Korea or Japan with limited land area and high population densities. That doesn't really apply here in Australia. And so I'd say you need firm, clean generation technologies to help replace coal, but there are other options that are likely to be deployed faster and more affordably in the Australian context.
Beautiful. Thanks, Jesse. Now, Saul, to get us all hyped up and excited for 2024, you've worked in the US and in Australia, you know the political context, the landscape and the energy systems. What is the opportunity and likelihood that we're going to replicate an Inflation Reduction Act here in Australia? And what do we need to do?
I'm going to just finish on the nuclear point, even though you don't want to give it air. I think it's important. So I think we should accept the fact that the coalition, meaning the opposing half of government here supporting nuclear, is a victory for electrification. They've now, in essence, admitted that you have to change the energy system and clean it up, and that will happen through electrification. They're just currently backing nuclear. I agree with everything Jesse Jenkins just said, that in Australia, likely it is not the cheapest or fastest option. So we should be pursuing everything else in lieu of that. But I think we need to be cautious of sounding unscientific as a movement if we say no and never to nuclear, because there are distinct possibilities in the next decade or 2 decades, both in fission and fusion versions of nuclear, that there will be cleaner and safer alternatives that might be part of the system. So I think we need to continue to be pro-science while also being pro-renewables and pro-electrification and pro the economics. In terms of the IRA opportunity in Australia, the opportunity is a little bit different to the US. The economics work here because we do a lot of work through Rewiring America and we're at Rewiring Australia on the unit economics if you're a household or if you're a small business. And because of this rooftop solar miracle in Australia, really the economics are in for nearly every household in nearly every context to fully electrify. The problem here is a problem of finance. Probably the top 10 or 20% of households by income can afford to go to the bank and say, apply more money to my mortgage and go and electrify all the cars, and they'll save money starting tomorrow. So the challenge in Australia is, how do you electrify the rest of the country, the people who struggle to get the credit access or the finance access to afford this energy transition? And so I actually think that the big opportunity in Australia is to do all of the things that are in the IRA, more incentives for deploying industrial renewables, more incentives to help communities transition. I live in a community that is a traditional coal provider, the Illawarra. We are slated to have offshore wind. We've even been able to get in the language around that offshore wind project. How do you provide incentives for the community to say yes to this type of renewables? And it's exactly the types of things Jesse just said. It's like, what's going to fund our firefighters and our public schools if not coal? And it's going to be offshore wind and big solar. So we need all of those incentives. But I think the incentive that Australia can do that is even, in some respects, and Jesse said, America isn't going to hit its real climate goals, so they need even better legislation. I think Australia can look at America's IRA as, well, there is the best bar for legislation in the world. How do we go a little bit further? We can afford to go further because the economics are in, but then we need to realize that it's about, how does the government help the households, help small businesses with access to finance? Within the IRA, there are things like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and the green banks that are specifically to provide credit access. And I think we can go further and farther on similar incentives here in a country that doesn't own the world's default currency. We are much more concerned about our economic balance, but you can actually now build an argument that the government financing Australian households, redefining what infrastructure means, given that more than half of our energy is likely to come off our rooftops. If the government can invest in households with credit access to finance that solar and then finance the vehicles, which is where you'll save the most money, then we can do even more ambitious policy than America. Then hopefully the fascist dictator doesn't get in, and America will have another shot at legislation in a few years' time, and they can look to Australia and say, oh, here's a few things that Australia did that were further and farther than the IRA. I think we can also, on the industrial side, go a little bit further and farther in the manufacturing and the critical minerals than the IRA did. There was good work there, but not enough again. So, my hope is, and it will only happen if we build this advocacy army in Australia, is that we can push our government on the economic benefits over the long term to invest in Australia to do these things. And then it will push the rest of the world to have more ambition the next time it comes around to their turn.
Brilliant. Thank you, Saul. Enjoyed the call to action at the end there. Look, that's the end of our formal proceedings. I just want to thank you all again for attending. Thank you, Jesse and Saul. But I've got a few asks of you as well. Please sign up to our mailing list to hear more about what we're going to be doing in 2024 to really build our electrification army. I'm leaning into it too, Saul, but also continue our advocacy work next year and into the future. We really want you on the team and be part of that. There's been a number of requests for the recording. It is going to be available on our website for review and sharing with all your friends. We've also had some requests for being able to compile some of the links that were shared in the chat. We'll look into how feasible that is, but we can put some of the top ones in there as well. And yeah, thank you so much for coming, and please keep talking about why we need to electrify with your friends and family over Christmas. And we really look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thank you very much. Cheers.